Hi, good morning, afternoon, whenever you're watching this. I'm going to be doing some intertestamental period garbage here, so hopefully that's what you tuned in for. Got a couple of yahoos here that are telling me about crayfish and whatnot. Good for them. They got on it and they got in here and got their stuff done. They're still wondering what color its blood is. Is it white or is it clear or what is it? I don't know. Whole wheat. So today we're going to change the screen here. We're going to hopefully be looking at some of these questions down here on the matching Jewish groups, Jewish sects of the Second Temple period. Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and the people. And I'm going to do my darndest to get through as many of them as possible, but I may not get them all into one lecture. If we were looking at our intertestamental period slideshow thing, see if it'll allow me to go there. Let's scroll down to where we got our stuff for today. Herods, the Herods, Pontius Pilate. Pharisees. Yeah, we're going to talk about Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and their place, the Zealots and the people of the land. That's what we're going to do. And in the next episode, hopefully we'll talk about religious life of this period. So the reason why I want to bring this up is because once we get to the New Testament, all of a sudden there's these Pharisees and Sadducees and there's Sanhedrins and there's these lawyers and scribes and all this kind of stuff, zealots, religious groups that we don't read about in the Old Testament. So that's why we're trying to bridge the gap. We want to say, well, it wasn't in the Old Testament, but now it's in the New. Where in the world did that come from? So here we go. Oftentimes it's portrayed that everybody in Jesus' time was like all the same. If you're a Jew, there was just certain things that you did, but that really wasn't true. They had political parties, religious political parties. They had those that would pay to Caesar and those that wouldn't. They had those that would take up arms and would attack. If you've read the Bronze Bow, then you know about some of that kind of stuff. You've got two totally left and right sides of the political aisle with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and then you got all these others, Herodians. You've got a whole mix of people, so it wasn't all just homogeneous. It wasn't all the same. You have very much what we would see today, people all over the spectrum. So Judaism was composed of numerous groups and parties, each believing that they had the right version of the truth. The people who heard Jesus were composed mainly of the following 5 groups. I'm going to read to you from Josephus what he has to say about these guys too. Pharisees, Sadducees, we've got the Essenes, religious group, like a very much out in the middle of the desert kind of monkish type of group. Zealots, and then the peoples of the land. Okay, so when Josephus is talking about this under his chapter on the Roman governors, he says this, that the Pharisees regard observance of their doctrine and commandments as of most importance, and they believe that souls have power to survive death and receive rewards or punishment. Like, there's their views of the afterlife. They're very influential among the townspeople, so that'd be out in Galilee and out in the cities where there's synagogues. All rites of worship are performed according to their exposition. So they're like the holder of the keys in the synagogue. The Sadducees teach that the soul dies along with the body, and they observe no traditions apart from the written laws. Whenever they assume office, however, they submit to the formulas of the Pharisees because the masses would not tolerate them otherwise, but they're really in charge of the temple worship and the exchanges, and they're like upper class, rich money people. Essenes believe in the immortality of the soul and strive for righteousness, but they use a different ritual of purification for their sacrifices, and so are barred from the temple sanctuary. The 4,000 in this sect hold their property in common, so they're communistic, and do not bring wives or slaves into the community, but live off by themselves. So they're like monks. Always dressed in white, they do not change their clothes until they are worn threadbare. That's a little sketchy. They deem oil defiled and purify themselves in cold water. A candidate joins their order only after a 3-year probation, and they are also extraordinarily interested in ancient writings. So strictly do they observe the Sabbath that they will not even defecate on that day. You want to know, You don't have a good vocabulary, defecate means poop. The fourth philosophy, the Zealots, agrees with the Pharisees, except that they have an overwhelming desire for liberty, with the conviction that God alone is their leader. They will easily endure any sort of pain or death so long as they do not have to call man their master. These, then, are the philosophies among the Jews. In brief, unquote, Josephus. First group are the Pharisees. We're very familiar with that from the Gospels. And they began, as we mentioned in the previous episodes there, under Jonathan Maccabee, mentioned by Josephus. They were the party of the synagogue and strove to reinterpret the law. They built the hedge around the law. You don't want to break the law, so let's give you 3 layers of things you can't do so you don't even get close, to breaking the law. Jesus talks about how they tithed mint and dill and cumin. They had things down to the nth degree, but yet their hearts were far away from the Lord. They thought that if they just obeyed all commandments A through Z, then they were just fine. As the custodians of the oral law, that is, the series of commands and teachings that they had, commentary on the law that helped you not break the law, that you had to keep those things too, like how do you wash your hands and how you wash your pots and all that kind of stuff. They built a hedge around the Torah to enable Jews to live righteously before God in a different world than that which existed in the days of Moses. Though there weren't a lot of them, they kept their numbers pretty small. You had some pretty serious standards to be, the level of perfection to be in that group, though Paul was. They enjoyed the support of the people. People held them in high respect. They listened to them. They saw their righteousness out externally, and they were like, whoa, these guys know what they're talking about. Though that wasn't like, the rule. Pharisees of Jesus' day were divided into the strict or conservative school of Shammai and the more liberal or lenient school of Hillel. The main disciple of Hillel was this guy named Gamaliel, which we read about in Acts chapter 4. And one of his main disciples, the most successful of his disciples probably, was this guy named Saul from a place called Tarsus. And Paul admits readily that I'm a Pharisee and I'm the son of a Pharisee. So that's kind of like where, his tradition that he grew up in. Fourth, they were the only party to survive the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and were spiritual forefathers of later Judaism. Let me read you from Matthew 22 what he says here in a discussion with the Pharisees. Starting in verse 34. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had put the Sadducees to silence, they gathered themselves together. And one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment on the law? And he said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depends the whole law and prophets. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them a question, because they're experts, right? Who do you think the Christ is? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. And he says to them, Then how does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I put thine enemies beneath thy feet. If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son? And no one was able to answer him a word, nor did anyone dare from that day to ask him another question. He put him down. He knows the word better than they know, and they're the experts. One more passage on this. When Paul's arrested and he's standing before the Sanhedrin in Acts 23, he says this, Perceiving that one part of the group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, Paul began crying out in the council, Brethren, I am a Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. I am on trial for the hope and resurrection of the dead. And as he said this, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided, for the Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirit, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. And there arose a great uproar, and some of the scribes of the Pharisaic party stood up and began to argue heatedly, saying, We find nothing wrong with this man. Suppose a spirit or an angel has spoken to him. And as a great dissension was developing, the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them, and ordered the troops to go down and take him away from there by force and bring him into the barracks. So he used the fact that these guys have differing views on theology to split them up and make them fight with each other rather than with him. Okay, so you got an idea of these guys from, if you read The Chosen by Chaim Potok, you got basically, these are the Hasidic, these are the strict Jewish folks that grow their sideburns out long, like Danny and his dad. Our next group are the Sadducees, from the word Zadok, Sadducee, or Zadik, which means righteous. So they walk around and go, well, we're the righteous ones. They were more Hellenistic. This group was made up of aristocrats, upper crust, rich folks. They became closely associated with the temple and the temple worship and the Temple Mount. And because of their position, the Sadducees had a vested interest in keeping things quiet so that business as usual was going on in the temple. That's where they made their money, buying and selling, and the exchange of money and whatnot that happened there in the temple. They would get money off of that. So they controlled everything, all the business that went on at all the festivals when people came to make sacrifices. Again, few in number, but they wielded political power and they controlled the high priesthood. Didn't have to be a Zadok priest, didn't even have to be a Levite at this point. They controlled who it was. It was supposed to be a hereditary thing, descendants of Zadok, but they cut that out and they just gave it to like the highest bidder, very much like how popes were chosen in the Middle Ages and whatnot. They honored the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, above everything else, and rejected any doctrine they didn't think came from the Torah. Though resurrection and immortality, Jesus argued that in Matthew 22 from the law. And he did that by saying, like, Abraham, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the God of the living, not the dead. And he kind of chastises them and says, look, you know this, so why don't you understand what I'm talking about? And again, there in Acts 23, Paul uses this as the wedge to split the Sanhedrin into two factions, so they fight with each other rather than for him. Be like standing up in Congress and then bringing up taxes or something like that. Thirdly, you got the Essenes, a separatist group. These are like your crazy monks out in the desert kind of dudes. These are like your conspiracy theory guys, emphasizing strict legal observance but rejecting the temple priesthood and sacrificial system. They say that's all corrupt, and so we're going to do our own thing. We're the true, pure people. But like we mentioned, they had some pretty weird rules about washing and cleansing and stuff. They'd go a certain distance outside the camp to go to the bathroom. When they came back, they had to take baths all the time. But then they wore their clothes until it just totally wore out. They're first mentioned during the reign of the Hasmonean Jonathan in circa 154 BC. They're described by Josephus, Philo, and the Roman historian Pliny. There is an important community that has been dug up down by the Dead Sea. It's called Qumran. It's near like a former city there by the north side of the Dead Sea. There's a bunch of caves up there too where they hid their writings. They separated themselves largely from Judaism, so they were in there like storing up grain and rice and whatever for the end of the world. So they're definitely hoarders. They were preparing for the final war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. There's been a lot of stuff that's been discovered about them because of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the discovery of those back in 1948. They did collect the Old Testament scriptures, but they also collected the Apocrypha and First and Second Maccabees and other Jewish mystical writings. They had a huge collection of things that they thought were pretty important. But they did preserve the scriptures, which is pretty cool. They would be kind of on the same scale as folks that I guess practice Kabbalah, that modern Jewish Gnosticism, mysticism that you read about, where I guess it's Danny's dad does some of that stuff there in The Chosen, where he's like, this word is made up of these letters, and if you add these together, it comes to this, which means that such and such. So they would have been kind of like those type of folks. Our fourth group are the Zealots, referred to by Josephus there as the fourth philosophy. He traces their beginning back to AD 6 to a guy named Judah of Gamla, which is a city kind of in the north east of the land. and they ceased to exist in kind of the last stand that they took in AD 73 at the fortress of Masada, the last kind of siege of these zealots. They opposed payment of tribute to a pagan emperor since their allegiance was only to God. They were also called the Sicarii, which means dagger men. So they're assassins. They were guys that would make their way into a crowd and then stick somebody a jimmy and then take off in the melee. They're radical assassins. We know that one of these guys is converted and comes to follow Jesus, Simon the Zealot. Okay, so not Iscariot, but the other Simon, and not Simon Peter. The other Simon, the Zealot, one of Jesus' disciples. They believed in a future messianic kingdom, but they're trying to kind of bring it in as they say, if we can get rid of the Romans, the Messiah can come and help us with this. They thought their leader would be a Messiah figure. They also believe they could hasten, like I said, its arrival through their military overthrow of Rome's occupation. So this does sound like things that happen in today's world. We're going to bring in the kingdom. We're going to bring in the kingdom by, taking care of this and that and the other thing. So don't come and steal our guns, because we're going to make America the kingdom of God and stuff. So lastly are the peoples of the land. That would be just your normal Joe, the people that Jesus liked to spend most of his time amongst. Not a group or a party, term that describes the masses who led normal lives, didn't have deep religious training. In fact, most of them were probably illiterate and needed to go and have things explained and read to them at the synagogue. You have heard that it was said. Well, they'd have to hear it because they couldn't read it. They didn't get involved with government, either in advocating or opposing Rome's occupation. They're just the normal people that you'd find in the land. A few passages here, John 7. Sometimes the text calls them the crowd. And the crowd eventually, leaves Jesus. It says this in John 7. Pharisees are talking to Jesus, but then it says the multitude which does not know the law is accursed. That was the Pharisees' version or view of the multitudes of the people. They don't know the law. They're cursed. They're just ignorant idiots out there in the boonies. We got Mark chapter 12, verse 37. The great crowd enjoyed listening to Jesus, and I think they liked watching the Pharisees get their comeuppance as well. Lastly, in Acts chapter 4, verse 13. Now, as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were marveling because they recognized as them having been with Jesus. So they're like, these guys are just Galileans. They're like normal people. And here they are preaching these wonders and confounding us. They were just normal people, right? Fishermen, working people. So as you read the book of Mark, especially, the group is just the crowd. And at first, there's many, many people that follow Jesus around. And then he kind of figures out they just came because they wanted some free food or whatever, and many leave Jesus when his teaching becomes very hard. We could also talk about the Samaritans, but we already did. We're about 19 minutes, so we're going to call it a day here. And yep, so there's your folks, people of the land, Jewish groups of the Second Temple period. Tune in next time for our discussion of the religious life of the Second Temple period.